On behalf of the co-hosts Terry and WASP and the Adaptation Futures 2020 Secretariat, I extend a warm welcome to our esteemed panelists and our audience to the Adaptation Futures pre-conference webinar today on climate change, adaptation and migration, supported by the East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities Project. Till date, we've had 9 successful pre-conference webinars, each of which have seen insightful and informative discussions on topical issues by leading experts in the field of climate change adaptation. The webinar today will give us a chance to understand the perspectives and learning from policymakers, practitioners, and scientific experts working in the intersection of climate change and migration, thus reflecting on the overall theme of the conference of emphasizing knowledge sharing and co-learning for actionable solutions across global north and the south. Few housekeeping announcements for the webinar today. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be published on YouTube. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with your colleagues. This webinar will run for 1 hour and 45 minutes. During this time, we would request you to keep your cameras switched off and the mic muted at all times. Attendees are encouraged to post questions in the chat box at any point during the webinar. With that, I will not waste more time and will welcome the team from PIC to take forward the discussions for today. Thank you.
Hello and good morning or good afternoon to some of you. I would like to also thank everyone for joining us today and welcome you all to today's event on climate change, adaptation and migration, which is co-organized by Terry and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, also referred to often as PIC, through a collaboration through a project called EPIC, which stands for East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities. This is a research project that is part of the International Climate Initiative, or ICI. My name is Julia Blocher. I'm a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, as well as the president of the International Youth Federation. And I'm co-moderating today with my colleague, Dr. Roman Hoffman, who you will hear from a bit later. So I wanted to start us off by, of course, thanking our co-organizers at Terry. We're really doing a great job to ensure that the essential conversations initiated through the Adaptations Futures Conference can continue despite the physical constraints due to the current pandemic. This has been really impressive and also very much appreciated. So thanks again to Terry. We've already heard a bit about the question that's bringing us here together today on the linkages between climate change, adaptation, and human mobility, which we see as something of increasing interest to academics as well as to policymakers. And I should note here that within the kind of umbrella term of human mobility, we will refer also to migration, displacement, planned relocations, as well as this more emerging topic of immobility and trapped populations. So I think it's fair to say that this year we've seen really a propagation of policy discussions on this topic, from the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement to the dedicated report on the slow onset adverse effects of climate change from the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons, as well as a number of discussions around the Global Compact on Migration, Global Compact on Refugees that were agreed on 2 years ago. So our added value really in this is to take stock of the current and new knowledge in the on climate mobility linkages, as well as to think about ways to address gaps in policy as well as gaps in research. So to do this, we've brought together a very diverse and also expert group of people. The main part of today's discussion will be presentations on new research on climate migration linkages, followed by a moderated discussion with a panel of key experts who can respond to the research presentations, relate them to their own work in the key institutions that they represent, and also add their own perspectives to the discussion. So I suspect you've all seen the order of the speakers. So rather than introduce them now, we're going to introduce each of them just before they are given the floor. So I want to start, of course, with our 2 keynote speakers, and we're very honored to have them with us today. We have Professor John Schellnhuber, who is the Director Emeritus of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and Dr. AJ Mathur, who's the Director General of the Energy and Resources Institute, or TERI. We've asked each of them to speak for 5 minutes to really help us frame the discussion in giving us a glimpse of the bigger picture issues and that we're discussing, and by addressing the topic of climate change impacts and the importance of climate capacities for adaptation. So Professor Schellenhuber, we'd like to start with you. Professor Schellenhuber is also the Senior Scientific Advisor of the EPIC project that brings PIC and TERI together to discuss and further research the topic of climate change and migration. So Professor Schellenhuber, you have the floor. Please unmute when you're ready.
Yeah, okay. I guess you can hear me. Thank you very much, Julia. Hello, everybody, wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are right now. So, yeah, I'm very happy to provide some introductory remarks here in my capacity as the Director Emeritus of the Potsdam Institute and somebody who, together in particular with Kira Finke, pulled off the EPIC project. An EPIC project is about capacity building. And what does that mean? I used to phrase it and to frame it in terms of a transmitter-receiver task. Actually, the transmitter is, of course, the expert community that is trying to come up with always improved and ever better, so to speak, scientific information. So an example is clearly forecasting of monsoon dynamics, which is extremely important for India, for example, but also for West Africa, for example. And if we come up with better predictions, then of course the receiver problem kicks in, because how will the planners, the decision makers and so on digest this type of information? In the end, you have to convert it into better institutional forecasting. And of course, then you have to provide the people on the ground, the farmers, for example, with the pertinent information. And if the pertinent information does not avoid major damages, you have to come up with subsidy programs and so on. But I think that while we are improving on the transmitter side, the receiver side still needs a lot of amendment, actually. And that means, what are the institutional implications in the various countries involved on the climate adaptation side? The other thing, and it's on the other end of the range of applications, is migration, clearly. Migration, you can again do it in a top-down way. So if you say, well, the coastal zones of Bangladesh will become uninhabitable in 50 years from now, when the government of Bangladesh, for example, or the government of India, when you look to other coastal zones, will have to make planning decisions. Will we simply prohibit people to settle in those regions? So these are very hard and painful decisions to be made. But we could also do it in a different way. We could ask our information provided, what do they mean for people on the ground? That means people who have become already migrants right now and are wandering somewhere or are trapped in certain spaces, or people who are prospective migrants, or people who are potential migrants, or people, and that is the most important of all, are avoided migrants. Because based on our information, they will not actually expose themselves in a way that will turn them into refugees in 20, 30 years from now. These are existential information, actually. So all this has to be covered. So you see, it's a big spectrum of things on the transmitter, on the receiver side. And ideally, our information produced in academic research will help individuals in the future to not enter the trap of sort of refugees who are simply there, stuck in a place, and their livelihoods will go away. So you see, we have a lot of responsibility here. And co-creating, and I repeat that, the co-creation of information, but also the co-creation of institutional sort of systems that are able to digest, to absorb, to convert, and to use our information. That is an extremely important issue right now. as we see that global warming is proceeding. You may have heard November 2020, the hottest November on record again. And this in spite of the fact that we are in a La Nina phase in the ENSO dynamics. So the signs on the wall become bigger and bigger. Anyway, I think this is an extremely important project, and co-creating the relevant information will becomes ever more important. So I'm glad we have this webinar, but I'm also glad to see my dear colleague Ajay on the screen already now, who will follow us. I think the two of us, Ajay, we are in a way a sort of an example of how to co-create information and to work together across continents, actually. So I'm very glad that you will follow now me, and I give the floor to Ajay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Shanhuber, and a very good morning or good afternoon to all other colleagues who both on the panel and the very, very many participants who we have in this webinar. I want to first of all compliment Professor Shanhuber for his extremely directed thoughts. The idea of a receiver and transmitter is something, Professor Shanhuber, that I think has helped us all immensely in moving ahead and conceiving not just of the problem but also of the solutions. And I think the EPIC project together has been able to bring together communities from different parts of the world to look at specific problems and therefore, to use Professor Shanhuber's words, co-create solutions that make sense and are replicable. We are obviously talking here in terms of migration. And the EPIC project in India is looking at a very specific issue of the migration from a state which is a hilly state. It's a state where migration has occurred for a very, very long time. And the migration has occurred because employment opportunities in the hills are relatively lower than those in the plains. This is why it has traditionally happened. But what we are seeing now is an acceleration. So the short point is that we are looking at, on the one hand, the climate, the impacts of climate leading to migration not only of the economic breadwinner, but also of entire families, particularly from the hilly areas of India. So this is one kind of migration where it's not just a single person or a set of persons, but the entire families who move into areas where they don't have roots. The second thing which I was talking about was what we saw during the COVID pandemic, when we saw people, because of a lack of job opportunities and flows of incomes that were disrupted, moving back into familial homes. So on the one hand, you have people, families moving out of particular areas. On the other hand, you have people moving back with their families. Now, all of this highlights, all of this is based on an understanding that at the end of the day, migration hurts people. And particularly forced migration hurts people because they move without the kind of infrastructure that they would have had, either for living habitation in new areas, for economic livelihoods in new areas, for the connectedness, whether at work or with other people who have moved there before. So as we look at the issue in a larger context, I would like to highlight, what was stated in a World Bank report that, I think it's called Preparing for Internal Climate Migration, that if not checked, these impacts from extreme as well as slow onset climate events, and I'm reading this, would witness over 140 million people moving within their own countries by 2050. Now, very clearly, those of us who live in the South Asian region, and we look at the figure which they produced of 40 million for this region, in a sense, it's mind-boggling because you don't know how to absorb this large number. This creates a human crisis which threatens development. Now, let's flip this over and see what are the kinds of ways that we move ahead. That's what EPIC is about. And what we are looking at is one, identification of where this problem is. I think it is important to make a distinction between the kinds of economic opportunity migrations that have occurred, and that's why the Uttarakhand example that we're looking in India under EPIC is an interesting one, and the climate-based migration that you add on top of it. So what we are therefore looking at are, one, the creation of job opportunities in particular areas which are resilient to the adverse impacts of climate change. In India, for example, these are opportunities, for example, of creating rural infrastructure for the preservation of crops, cold storages, for example. Cold storages haven't been made largely because of the poor supply of electricity, and if electricity is not there, you use diesel gensets, makes it very expensive. But now with the fall in prices of renewables, you've got absolutely new opportunities. It also means that there is the creation of skilled jobs and therefore skilled high-paying jobs for those who want it. This is a way of moving out of the unskilled labor in rural areas as well. The second issue is frameworks, and frameworks of social protection, but more importantly of our ability to provide for such migrants, whether it is living spaces, whether it is food, or whether it is opportunities. And in my view, the key here, the one which is not talked about as much, but which is the focus of EPIC, is skill building. Because we can take advantage of the fact that you've got more labor available, but you can only take advantage if they have the kind of skills that we need. And consequently, figuring out what are the kinds of skills that are needed becomes the centerpiece of how we move ahead. Julia, I know that I'm hogging up time, but apologies for that. I do think that it is important that we focus on this important issue and focus on the kinds of institutional interventions which would both address it, reduce it, and help us move into the future with a lower impact of climate change than we would have otherwise. Many thanks, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathur, and apologies again for the technical difficulties. I really would love to thank both of our keynotes for giving us such an excellent framing for our discussion today, and really putting the focus on the receiving side of climate change adaptation, and especially this so-called end users of climate information, of climate services. But also both of our keynote speakers also raised some really important questions in terms of how migration fits into adaptation strategies, as well as when that may not be possible or may not be the most desirable adaptation strategy. So thank you again to both of you, and also for giving us some great information about the EPIC project. For those of us who joined us late, that EPIC stands for East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities, and we're together today to discuss some of the new information coming out of that research project, which is where we will turn now. I would like to introduce our two speakers from the EPIC project. First, Dr. Roman Hoffman, who is a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, as well as the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. So today, Dr. Hoffman will delve into some of the core concepts of climate-related mobility, but most of all will give us an overview of what the current body of research on this topic says through a recent meta-analysis. So Dr. Hoffman, please unmute and share your screen when ready.
Thank you very much, Julia, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It is my pleasure to present to you today one of our research projects on climate change and migration that we have recently completed. In the project, we use a meta-analysis approach to consolidate and synthesize the existing evidence on climate change and migration, considering a sample of country-level studies. The project is joint work with colleagues of mine, Anna Dimitrova, Raya Mutarak, Jesus Crespo-Quaresma, and Jonas Paiska. In many parts of the world, we observe very close relationships between changing environmental conditions and environmental hazards and migration patterns and trends. The question is whether these represent actual causal relationships between environmental factors and migration, or whether those are mere associations. In the past years, there has been an increasing number of quantitative studies that have tried to provide answers to this question and to analyze under which conditions and where climatic factors can influence migration as a migration driver. These studies range from case studies in highly localized settings to macro studies analyzing global migration flows, that is, migration flows between different countries. While the majority of these studies agrees that environmental and climatic conditions are important for human mobility, they partly come to very different conclusions in what way and how strongly migration depends on these factors. In our study, we tried to provide a synthesis of the existing statistical evidence on environmental migration worldwide. Using a meta-analysis approach, we explored differences across study settings, and with this tried to better understand how and under which conditions climatic factors can have an influence on migration. In total, we focus on 30 macro studies that estimate more than 1,800 different relationship coefficients using longitudinal country-level data. That is, these studies look at basically different relationships between different climatic drivers and migration outcomes. And in our study, we take all of this evidence into account. The study was recently published in the journal Nature Climate Change and can be accessed through the link below. For the sake of time, I will restrict myself here to a few key findings. As a first key finding, we can show in our analysis that there is robust evidence that environmental factors drive migration. But, and this is important, there is no automatism at play. The results of the different studies, and also within the different studies, they differ quite substantially. Whereas some studies find a clear relationship between changing climatic conditions, others do not, or even report a negative relationship, that is, a relationship in which climatic changes constrain migration. Climate migration as a multi-causal process always depends on a number of economic and sociopolitical factors and other contextual influences. This is something which we can show very clearly in our meta-analysis study. In particular, we find that agricultural livelihoods and agricultural vulnerabilities are an important moderator of the climate-migration relationship. I would also like to highlight here that the strongest relationships between changing climatic conditions and migration are found for internal as well as regional migration, that is, migration that remains within a region as opposed to far-reaching international migration. Finally, I would just like to emphasize once more that climatic impacts can influence the livelihoods and living conditions of populations in various ways. In our study, we can show, for example, that income disruptions and conflict are found to be two important mechanisms that act as co-migration drivers and that can be strongly influenced potentially by changing climatic conditions. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation with summarizing some of the key insights from our study. As we have shown, environmental factors alone are rarely the only migration driver, but one of many, and their impacts depend very much on the local context and alternative adaptation options available to local populations. Likewise, in relation to the topic of this webinar, whether or not migration can support adaptation to climatic changes depends on local conditions, capacities, and resources. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly point you to different follow-up studies of our group that we're currently preparing that build on some of the insights of this meta-analysis. Please feel free to reach out to me should you have any questions or require further resources. And with this, I would like to end, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoffman. We really appreciate you giving us an overview of the really current state of the art on this topic, and for presenting your recent meta-analysis, which for those of you who weren't able to capture everything because of the technical difficulties, I would point out is available online and it is published. You can read the paper, but I do want to thank you again for giving us a few insights into the topic that we're discussing today, especially in terms of addressing the multi-causality of migration decisions, as well as the very diverse outcomes of different types of mobility and of those movements. So thank you very much. I now would like to turn from the very kind of macro picture to a more concrete case study, and this will be provided by Himani Upadhyay. Sorry, I'm not the best at pronouncing this name, but you may also present yourself, Himani. Himani is a doctoral researcher at PIC investigating climate migration linkages in India as part of the EPIC project. And today she's going to give us an overview of some recent research in the Indian state of Uttarakhand. So Himani, if you could share your screen, and hope that you have a bit more luck with the internet connection. Over to you. I can see it in a screen.
I apologize for chipping in, but may I please request the presenters to switch off their video in case a similar glitch in the internet connection comes up again. It could resolve the bandwidth issue.
Very good idea.
So I'll switch off my video. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Roman, for your presentation. I hope my presentation is visible. Hello, everyone. A very good morning and good afternoon. My name is Himani Upadhyay, and I work at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. I'm delighted to be presenting here at the Adaptation Futures webinar, and would like to thank my fellow colleagues at PIC and at TERI for organizing this event. I will be speaking on the topic of climate migration and depopulation, and presenting you some evidence from India. Before I get into the onto my topic, I would briefly like to introduce the project of which you have already heard, which is called EPIC, and it stands for East Africa, Peru, India Climate Capacities. It is organized into 5 work packages, and I work on climate change and migration dynamics in India. We are collaborating with TERI on this project and the German Weather Service, and it is supported by the International Climate Initiative of the German Environment Ministry. So as you just heard from Roman about the macro perspective on this topic, I will present to you a micro perspective or a case study which I have been doing in Uttarakhand, which is a state in the Indian Himalayan region in the northern part of India. And why we chose this case study was because of the some existing preconditions which were reporting climate change and migration linkages in the state. In order to assess this further, we have now prepared an evidence synthesis report along with our partner TERI, which is called Climate Change and Migration in Uttarakhand, where we present all the evidence that we could gather on this topic, along with some new analysis done on climate and extremes. And one of the outcomes or the findings of this report is a livelihood risk map, which you can see on your right, which essentially outlines the projected climate impacts, shows temperature increase in the hill districts in the north, precipitation increase mostly in the south or the plain districts, increase in projected climate extremes, which is increase in very warm days and heavy precipitation days. There's risk of glacial melt. Also outlines migration indicators in terms of district origin of migrants, and also where the migrants are going. What this map essentially shows is a risk to livelihoods. As you can see that in the northern, in the center, and the western region, climate impacts are affecting agrarian communities which are dependent on subsistence-based livelihoods and are dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and these are contributing to the existing migration conditions in the state. However, it's not just climatic, but also non-climatic factors which influence migration, and this links to what Roman just explained. So there are environmental factors. As I mentioned, there's going to be more heat and more rain and more climate extremes in the future, which have impact on agriculture, water, and habitability, which are linked to the economic factors, where 70% of the population in the state is agrarian. And if there are impacts on agriculture, there are lack of livelihood options or alternate livelihood options which they can tap onto, which affects household income. And they are kind of pushed towards employment opportunities which are available in the plains, which offer higher income and also income security. Most of the people in Uttarakhand are moving from the hills to the plains, and 70% of the migration is internal. And this could also be attributed to factors like lack of basic infrastructure, a strong presence of sociocultural factors where people aspire to go to cities. They associate a sense of success with that. There are political factors at play where most of the investments done by governments have been in the plains, and hill communities face a sort of marginalization. So it's a coming together of different kind of climatic and non-climatic factors which is driving migration in the state of Uttarakhand. Another something unique that is happening in the state is depopulation. 2 districts in the state are showing a negative population growth. As many as 734 villages are completely uninhabited, and there's declining population on the count of 50% in another 565 villages. In my preliminary analysis of data collected in this region, it shows that it's impacting socio-cultural and socio-economic fabric of the state, which is negatively impacting the adaptive capacities of communities, the collective coping capacity to manage climatic changes in the region. On the right, you can see some photographs of empty houses or abandoned houses due to outmigration in the region. Lastly, I would like to focus on immobility, which is essentially a blind spot, so to say, in climate change and migration nexus, as most of the research is often focused on migrants and their destinations. However, not everyone can or wants to migrate. Often people who stay behind are either discussed as trapped due to a lack of resources, people who are left behind or are discussed as sedentary. However, it could simply be a preference for non-migration. For people who stay behind, in my analysis shows that it's mostly women, elderly women. They could be exposed to different kind of vulnerabilities which could multiply due to climate change. This raises the question that how do we really address the preference to stay or the inability to migrate in the climate change, migration, and adaptation discourse. Lastly, I would like to end with perhaps a question that we have these scientific findings from the EPIC project, and we are trying to present this or to the policymakers in Uttarakhand. How do we really bridge the research and policy linkages? So thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Himani, for this excellent overview of your recent work in Uttarakhand. I think this was really very helpful to learn a bit more, not just about the climatic factors that contribute to migration decisions, but also the non-climatic factors that are interlinked and sometimes difficult to disentangle from the climate signal. I also appreciate that you brought in the question of immobility and the cases in which people may choose to stay behind, may be trapped in the areas in which they in situ adaptation strategies may not be as effective as they were previously, and other reasons why people remain immobile in potentially risky situations. So we hope that we can bring you back in a bit later, perhaps into the panel discussion, and certainly also Roman, because of the technical difficulties that you faced. We hope you can also add some more of your own insights into the panel discussion. So with that, I wanted to hand over to you, Dr. Hoffman, for the next part of the event, which is the moderated discussion. So thank you again. And for those of you in the audience, you may hear from me a bit later, bringing in some of your questions that you've hopefully added into the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. It is my pleasure to open today's expert panel on climate change, adaptation, and migration. For those of you who have just joined, my name is Roman Hoffman. I'm a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital, and I will moderate the panel discussion today. First of all, I would like to warmly welcome all of our panelists. With 5 distinguished experts from different international and academic organizations working on climate change impacts on migration and displacement. Andrew Harper from UNHCR, Bina Desai from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, Andrea Milan from the International Organization for Migrations, Global Migration Data Analysis Center, Professor Debolina Kundu from the National Institute of Urban Affairs in India, and Kira Finke from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Thank you all for joining us today. The panel will broadly discuss whether and under which conditions migration can support adaptation to climate change and what generally challenges to adaptation are, how vulnerable groups, for example populations who fail to adapt or migrants on the move, can be effectively protected, and how frameworks of protection, as Dr. Mathur has mentioned them before in his opening speech, can look like, and what the implications and gaps in policy and research are. Before introducing our experts to you and giving them the floor to make their opening remarks, I would like to invite our audience to post any questions or comments you may have into our chat. My colleagues Julia, Bloche and I will be closely monitoring the chat and direct any fitting questions to the panelists during the discussion. Then, without further ado, I would like to introduce and give the word to our first panelist, Andrew Harper, who is the UNHCR's Special Advisor on Climate Action. In this function, he is responsible for providing strategic guidance, oversight and expertise to shape UNHCR's climate action agenda. Prior to his current tasks, he was the Director of the Division of Program Support and Management and has led the Innovation Service at UNHCR. He was also responsible for leading and coordinating the international response to the Syrian crisis in Jordan and served as the head of desk for UNHCR covering the Iraq situation, as well as the emergency focal point for the Middle East and North Africa region for the Libyan crisis. He has previously worked notably for the Australian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in UNOCA, as well as in various. We are very grateful that you could join us today, and we're looking forward to hearing more from your rich experience about migration and displacement and how these are linked to climate change. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be present. And I think the fact that we are talking in such a situation with academics and humanitarians means that the whole discourse is changing too, because the humanitarian world is understanding that we need to place a greater emphasis on science and research in order to inform our decision making. And I think we can all appreciate the fact that climate change is occurring, is already shaping not a displacement, but also shaping the future of conflict. And that's something which is increasingly being recognized. Where there's conflict, you're going to have increasingly vulnerable groups and you're going to have displacement. So we're looking at the nexus as much as possible to anticipate future population movements due to climate change. It's not to say that we're going to be able to act in a way which will prevent people needing to flee, but if we understand that climate change is a risk multiplier or a threat multiplier or aggravates underlying grievances, then and if we can accept the fact that climate change is going to become more prevalent as one of those key drivers, then we can be working in a much more anticipatory way to anticipate where climate will lead to food insecurity, where it will lead to challenges in regards to the allocation of resources, increased fragility, where that could also then lead to the potential for failed states, lack of governance. And we're already seeing the start of that around the world. So UNHCR's positioning in all of this is very much not only that the vast majority of displaced populations are already located in very fragile areas and extremely prone to the impact of climate change as the host communities, but we're also looking to see how can we support preparedness measures, and it was also raised earlier about the increasing need to support adaptation measures so that people are better prepared for an increasing hostile future. What we're looking at is that better preparedness can lead to better protection and will potentially prevent the need for people to move in the first place. So what we are doing, and this is where it's great to be part of this panel, because we are working with PIC, we're working increasingly closely with IDMC and many others to ensure that we have a much more collaborative approach, common understanding of what some of the major risks and threats are, because unfortunately climate change, extreme weather events, environmental degradation will lead to increasing numbers of people to move. Not all of which will be due to conflict, but there will be that nexus where climate and conflict play out together, and that's where UNHCR, with a particular protection mandate, is very much concerned. So, and there's some stats which we're all probably aware of, that 7 out of the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change and least prepared to deal with climate change also hosting peacekeeping operations. So if we want to look at working in a much more strategic manner, then we have to be working together, and this is again why these webinars are so important. We need to be linking, firstly, the affected communities who have got most at stake in what's going on, and the authorities, but also working with development actors, the peace building actors, the private sector, and being better informed by academia. It doesn't make sense for agencies to be undertaking research themselves just for themselves. We need to be contributing to a much greater and cohesive understanding of the threats going across the region. And so one thing which I'd also like to say in regards to having a better understanding working with others is we're looking at the Sahel with academics as well as other UN agencies to have a better understanding of what will be some of the biggest threats and challenges the Sahel will have in 20 years time, 10 years time, 30 years time, because it's not just climate change which will be driving displacement, it also how it links with others. We're seeing a massive increase in the population of Sahel, doubling within the next 10, 20 years. We'll be looking at a decrease in the productivity levels for crop production. How will governments be providing education to a burgeoning population when they're going to have less income coming in? How will people be able to provide food? So we need to have a much more holistic understanding with everyone who's actually interested in the overall well-being in these very vulnerable situations. So what we're pushing for is not a reaction to the impact of climate change. It is to recognize that it's going to have an impact on populations who will be made more vulnerable, and how can we support the adaptation? How can we support the resilience? How can we support their empowerment so that they are the ones who can help guide us in making the right choices? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for these informative comments. I would like to welcome our next speaker on the panel, Bina Desai, who is the head of programs at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. In this role, she oversees the organization's program work, including global monitoring and reporting, thematic research, and data and risk analysis. She previously worked for the German Ministry for Development, the Aga Khan Development Network, Christian Aid, and the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, where she also co-authored and led the production of the United Nations Global Assessment Reports on Disaster Risk Reduction. Bina holds a PhD in social anthropology from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and an MSc in sociology and economics. Ina, thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your valuable expertise about the linkages between climate change, migration, and displacement, and about where and how migration can support climate adaptation and where not. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
But thank you very much for having me, and thank you really for inviting me to also comment, particularly after these really interesting two presentations that we had that show us about the multitude of drivers and the complexity of the issue. And I'd like to just put forward maybe a proposition that is not new, but something that we seem to be forgetting all the time, that migration is not something new. Migration as adaptation, in fact, as a concept may be a distraction, because that's has always happened. It's always been part of human and social and economic development. And which means that we need to look at not just the history of migration a bit more, I think, but also about what has really changed and what is it that we're concerned about if we're talking about migration in this context, about human mobility in this context. And we've been looking at IDMC into the topic from a perspective of an organization that's been monitoring internal displacement for more than 20 years. For around a decade, a little bit more than a decade, we've now systematically been tracking disaster displacement, mainly in the context of sudden onset events like floods, storms, earthquakes, etc. But we're also increasingly seeing the need to become more systematic at understanding displacement in the context of slow onset environmental change, climate change impact, etc. And it is clear from what we've already seen in the presentations and what the science tells us and what local case studies and community experience tells us, that for most people on the planet, really, the environmental factors and economic factors are not separate. It's an artificial distinction. So if we're talking about economic migration versus environmental migration, that is to some extent completely it's an artifact and a dichotomy that does just not hold, and that also distracts potentially from what we should be interested in, which is about choices ultimately. So when choices get so constrained in terms of whether you want to move or whether you want to stay, whether you can move or whether you can stay, that's when we need to be concerned, and that's what we're actually ultimately talking about. And that is really when we talk about displacement. So if we're thinking about climate as one factor of many, then we need to think about and resilience building or climate capacities, as was proposed by the EPIC project, as something that we can put against it. Then we need to think about what are we talking about? We're talking about adaptation, resilience, or capacities, and vis-a-vis what? Is it really vis-a-vis climate change and climate impacts, or is it in fact adaptation to already pre-existing unacceptable levels of inequality and marginalization, so pre-existing vulnerabilities? And this is really something that in the research has come out in the disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management research has come up for already decades ago, I'd say, and where in the displacement context, we're not really there yet, even though we know it intuitively and we see it in the numbers. But where displacement is high, where displacement risk is high, and ultimately, as Andrew was already mentioning, not by coincidence, it correlates with other types of high levels of or indicators that are really high in terms of vulnerability, as I mentioned, low levels of weak governance, low levels of coverage of social protection, etc., etc. So ultimately, displacement you could see as exposing the fault lines of development and of where development went wrong. So it's not about us now needing to adapt to something in addition, but maybe actually to look at adapting within a system that has created this issue in the first place. Having said that, so maybe one additional point on that before I then move on is the problem there is with this distraction maybe is that we depoliticize an issue that is highly political, highly contested. If we're talking about vulnerabilities, we're talking about social inequality, injustice, and everything that we don't sometimes want to touch with some of the science that we produce. But having said that, because I'm too in the business, of course, at IDMC of trying to build the best possible evidence to address the complexity of the issue, it's still a critical component, I think, in terms of really bringing the climate science together with what is happening on the ground. At IDMC, as I mentioned, we've been collating and analyzing global disaster displacement for quite a while. Every year, the numbers are extremely high. For example, for 2019, we've reported almost 25 million new displacements. So that's 25 million times that someone was forced to flee in the context of a disaster and then remained within their own countries. And of those 25 million, almost 24 million were weather related. And that's usually the case. The vast majority of displacements in these contexts are weather related or in the context of weather related disasters. And these are clearly going to be impacted also by the effects of climate change. So while we report every year on these issues, and while we see that the phenomenon is increasingly being reported on as one that is mediated by, shaped by, and increasingly determined by climate change, and we all, I think, collectively want to push against that a little bit. There are a few other misconceptions that I think it's important to understand and talk about when we talk about adaptation in this context, because it has clear implications, policy implications, programming implications. One is that displacement in these contexts is temporary, and that it is relatively short-term or seasonal or something that can be reversed, and that return is an option. And we've seen from the India presentation that, of course, that is often not the case. We've seen it in a lot of contexts where there's which is probably the most straightforward, where there's lots of territory, there's no option to return, but also in more complex situations where people have been moving because of loss of livelihoods or erosion of ecosystem services, the preference that they often do have. So the inability to return is also combined with a preference to stay where they've been moving to and for local integration. So it's often not a temporary measure. It's in the context of migration. This is something that you've all been researching and looking into. It's something that is really part of, as I said, a development trajectory, but also can become protracted in instances, in a negative way, in instances where this displacement, where this movement wasn't voluntary. And then secondly, the perception that there's going to be in the future mass migration because of climate change. We just heard the numbers again in the introduction of the World Bank report, other types of projections, which are based on often very localized studies, which are often extrapolating from one or two hazards, and which then end up in our perception of this being a future risk, but also one that would result in massive cross-border movement. Whereas in fact, we see that it is already happening, and it is mainly within countries or within regions. So those are just some of the issues that we need to address, I think, in future research and really unpack more and let the evidence speak, because the evidence actually speaks against these types of conceptions. And before I take up too much time, maybe just lastly, the fact that we've been all agreeing so far, and I'm sure we'll continue to agree on, that it's very location bound, it's very context specific. What happens, the triggers and the processes of migration, of displacement, are not just context specific, but also very much shaped by human agency. So that also has clear implications for the outcomes, because the way why people move and the way people move then means that their potential for finding, in a sense, a place to arrive at and solutions, as we say in the context of displacement, it has serious implications for those types of outcomes, and therefore also how we can respond to that. So there are inherent uncertainties within, if we look at current but also future migration and displacement in these types of contexts. And there's a key factor there that's missing. I think we're looking at we have the climate science, there are huge gaps in the data, but there's a much bigger gap even in understanding people's agency, as I mentioned earlier. So their perception of risk, their perception of what is important to them, but also of what constitutes a livable context and where that stops to be the case, and of their own choices, as I said at the beginning. So those kinds of tipping points that are shaped by environmental factors, but ultimately by the people themselves. So I'll just stop here and really look forward to the discussion. I think there's going to be a lot of very interesting comments following from Kira and Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina, and apologies again for the technical issues during my introduction. I hope you can now understand me well. Thank you very much for these valuable remarks. I think it's very important, as you mentioned, that we discuss we basically embed our discussion in pre-existing issues related to development, and think also how these are related to some of these challenges that many communities see when it comes to adaptation. Thank you also for pointing us to the importance of letting the evidence speak and bringing different fields of research together, but also of integrating the perspective of those people basically who are affected by increased level of climatic changes. So thank you very much. Our next speaker on the panel is Andrea Milan, who's the lead migration governance data at the IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center. Prior to joining IOM, Andrea has worked in the field of international migration for a number of international organizations, such as the UN University, UN Women, the Office of the UN Special Representative for International Migration, and the Food and Agricultural Organization. He holds a PhD in governance and policy analysis from the UNU Merit and the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance, as well as an MS in economics from the University of Ferrara. Andrea has published extensively on migration-related issues, and particularly on migration, environment, and climate change. And we're interested to hear more about his work and about the conditions under which migration can serve adaptation to climate change, and for whom. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's really hard to speak after two great presentations.
Andrea?
Yes.
Your microphone is not very clear to hear.
Oh, can you hear me better now?
Yes, when you move a bit closer, I think it's a little better.
Okay, I'll try to speak loud. Yeah, I don't know if this worked until yesterday. I'll try to speak loud. If I'm not clear enough, of course, I'll go get another microphone. Thank you very much, Roman. And as you were mentioning, my current focus is really from migration environment and climate change is on the data side. And it's interesting for me because, as you mentioned, in my background, I worked in this topic for several years, and now looking more at data aspects, I see some of the kind of the same issues that I was looking at in the more academic and research sphere moved into the data space. The first thing that I find very interesting is you were saying how you were highlighting a point raised by previous speakers that basically migration doesn't happen. Sorry, can you not hear me?
I think we should have somebody else speak first, because it's not that we cannot hear you. We can hear you, but it's with a lot of kind of disturbing noises. So one has to really focus to understand what you're saying. So maybe try to switch your microphone, and maybe we can.
You can go ahead if you wish, and I get a microphone. You want to speak now, and I speak next.
Yeah, so maybe Professor Kundu.
Yes, maybe we continue with the next speaker.
Dr. Milan,
apologies for...
Dr. Milan, I believe it is the problem of the microphone, the speaker from where you are. It's not the internet connectivity.
Yes.
So if you can change the microphone, please. Thank you.
Okay. So maybe Andrea, you can switch the microphone, and we move on to the next speaker in the meantime. Who is Debolina Kundu. She's a professor at the National Institute of Urban Affairs in India, with about 25 years of professional experiences in the field of development studies. She has worked as a consultant with the Asian Development Bank, LSE, IIEDS, UNDP, UNFPA, UNICEF, UNESCO, and several others. She works on issues of urbanization, migration, urban development policies, municipal finance, governance, and exclusion. She's currently also the editor of different journals on environmental issues and urbanization, such as the journal Environment and Urbanization in Asia and Urban India. She is also the country investigator for a project in India for the GCRF, Center for Sustainable Healthy and Learning Cities and Neighborhoods, which is supported by UK Research and Innovation. Professor Kundu, we are very grateful that you could join us today. And we're looking forward for you to share your experience about how urban areas in particular are affected by climatic impacts and what the implications of climate change and climate-related migration and displacement are for cities. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm not switching on the video because of internet issues. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to congratulate the team of the EPIC project and also thank the organizers and the Professor Hoffman, you in particular, for inviting me to this important event. We all are aware of the geographical of the risk of climate crisis. I don't think I need to emphasize on that, and the implications in urban areas because of this displacement. I think mostly people who are impacted, as brought out by Himani's study, are people from the low income bracket, the vulnerable. And when they are displaced and they come back to the urban areas, or they move from one urban area, from a marginal area to the other, I think their vulnerability gets doubled. And they generally shift to the slums, the informal settlements, where things are already not in a very good shape. I think this is one area where we need to focus. And the recent pandemic did bring to the focus that job creation and poverty alleviation is one area where we really need to focus. Employment generation schemes in the rural areas should be strengthened. When we look at the case of India, I think the MGREGA, the PDS system, these are the areas where we really need strengthening. And when we look, all this while we were looking at rural urban in silos. So I think there's more need for an integrated approach when we look at the impact of displacement in urban areas, because when if we look at in silos, I think we do not know what the consequences are and how we really need to plan for our cities. And the bigger cities are already in a very precarious state. If we take the example of India, and what we did an analysis for I think all the towns and cities in India, where we found that the peripheries are really growing at a faster rate than the core of the cities, the areas within the corporation areas, and the peripheral areas really need a lot of planning, which actually just now we do not find these areas to be planned or under any urban authorities. And here again we found the upcoming of, or the mushrooming of 2,530 new census towns. I think these are the areas which really need planning from inception. And also another important thing is that the people here, I think collectively and at the individual level, need to really know about the impending crisis. And when the city master plans, I think India has around 8,000 cities, and not even 500 towns and cities do have master plans. And when these master plans are being prepared under various government programs, there is a need to really integrate the climate concerns into the master plan, so that there is a legal framework supporting that. And the government of India has also started a climate smart cities assessment framework for all large cities. And I think that should also percolate to the small clusters of towns, where there is an initiative of assessing climate smart cities assessment framework with 28 indicators under 5 sectors, like energy and green buildings, urban planning, green cover and biodiversity, mobility and air quality, water management, and waste management. I think this attempt to address both mitigation and adaptation sites need to evolve, not only for these cities, but also the entire urban sector as a whole. And the national urban policy framework, I think that also needs to take into account these areas. And as has been mentioned by the earlier panelists, I think data is one important issue which needs to be addressed in addition to research, as well as climate capacities being really enhanced in the local bodies. I think Surat is one city where there is a provision of a climate officer in the local body. I think that needs again to be upscaled in the various cities, and this awareness about this entire crisis should be there at all levels. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Kundu, for your intervention and for your valuable comments. Thank you in particular for bringing in the perspective of urban destination areas to our discussion and for highlighting the implications climate change and climate-induced migration may have for urban areas. Thank you also for highlighting the important role preparedness and adequate planning may play in basically preventing and mitigating some of the consequences of climate change in this context. I would like to welcome our next speaker to the panel, Kira Finke, who works as a project lead at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, where she's leading the EPIC project that you have already heard about before. EPIC is an interdisciplinary project on the co-production of knowledge about regional climate and hydrological systems and their interactions with agricultural livelihoods and human migration. Ms. Finke is also the co-chair of the Advisory Council on Civilian Crisis Prevention and Peace Building of the German federal government. She has previously worked as a research and analysis to the PIC director, as an analyst to the director for the German Advisory Council on Global Change to the federal government, and as a consultant for the German Development Corporation and the Asian Development Bank, developing, among others, the flagship report, A Region at Risk, the Human Dimension of Climate Change in Asia and the Pacific. She holds a PhD in political science from Humboldt University and a master degree in international relations from the Freie University Berlin, Humboldt University in Berlin, and the University of Potsdam. Kira, thank you very much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you about the linkages between climate change, adaptation, and migration, and how adaptive and climate capacities can support people to migrate in an adaptive way or empower them to choose to stay successfully. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roman, and thank you to our audience for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. I think we now have solved most of them. And I will keep my interventions brief because I would like to hear questions from the audience as well. There's a few things that I wanted to focus on. One is the COVID crisis, which has shown us that all future crises, like a health crisis, like an economic crisis, etc., will happen against the backdrop of an increased baseline risk from climate change. So we are seeing that people have to deal with COVID and with other problems like economic inequality, like ethnic tensions, etc., against the backdrop of climate change. For example, we saw in Vanuatu that there has been an extreme tropical cyclone, while people were forced then to take preparations both against the health crisis, the pandemic, as well as against the cyclone. And this is just one of many examples, and I'm sure many of our panelists can attest to that. And another topic that was already mentioned by the IDMC is the issue of safe returns. And this is something we have discussed also together with Andrew Harper and other colleagues, what the possibilities for safe returns are in the future. So once people are displaced or even seek refuge in different countries, then their intention is to return someday to their homelands. But what if this is no longer possible because of degraded environmental conditions, or even in the extreme case, uninhabitability of certain areas? What does this mean for our policies in terms of what is the goal then of organizations such as UNHCR, who are working with people on the ground, such as IOM? Should it be to further mobilize people then to be able to go to freely choose where they want to go, or assist them more in their migration rather than prepare for returns? I think these are very important political questions, not only scientific ones, but really political questions. And another point about the COVID crisis is that we have seen these unprecedented efforts in order to tackle a complex crisis. And that, for example, finances were mobilized, which previously was unimaginable, that this type of financing in order to offset some of the negative effects of the economic downturns because of the interventions were mobilized. So this also poses to me the question, so if we have like sort of an anticipatory framework where we can expect next year will be a massive crop failure because of an El Nino event or something like this in 3 countries, how do we then go from this warning signal to the early action? And this a lot has to do not only with institutional preparedness, but also with how do we mobilize donors. So what have we done wrong, so to say, in the climate community, that we have not been able to kind of stimulate this anticipatory preventative action that we have now seen in many countries for the COVID crisis. The climate crisis is an existential one, and we're really running out of time to avert some of the worst effects of it, and are already in the middle of experiencing some of the not so extreme effects. So I think this is a lot to do with crisis communication, etc. And I would like to hear other panelists' views on this. And just to close, I wanted to comment on the very concrete examples that Professor Kundu gave us with climate officers in small and medium-sized cities. I think this is crucial to kind of limit the pressure of migration and population growth on urban cities, which is extreme in some cases. So and often these urban labor markets do not hold for opportunities for incoming migrants. So this is really a problem that needs addressing, because we're already seeing quite severe conditions in urban slums, etc. today, and it's a trend that will continue if we do not intervene with adequate measures tailored to the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kira. Thank you also for highlighting the linkages of some of the topics we're discussing today to the COVID-19 crisis, which is certainly very important in this regard, and also for highlighting the importance of moving from an early warning signal to the actual action, which is sometimes very, very difficult. Also for highlighting the role crisis communication can play in this regard. I see that Andrea Milan is now equipped with a headset, so I would just like to invite you to continue with your opening remarks that you started with before. Thank you.
Thank you, Roman. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm truly sorry. My computer rejected any microphone somehow and still got the audio from the computer. So sorry about that. So I'm jumping a bit later in the conversation and I missed a couple of remarks. So I'll try to keep it short and maybe just share a couple of reflections that I wanted to share already before the meeting, but also listening to the earlier speakers. I think I've been in this space for a few years, and now my focus is mostly on data. That since my current work for IOM focuses really on migration data and migration governance. One of the things that I found very interesting, it was mentioned earlier by several speakers, is the fact that when we look at migration in the context of environment and climate change, we're talking about migration that happens in a world where migration is already a reality, already happens anyway. So we're looking at a very complex situation, and I think there have been lots of advancements in terms of our understanding of when migration works, when migration brings positive change for households, for individuals, for communities. But still, we have lots of very interesting case studies. And what I think has been, or where I see a lot of space for further development, is trying to draw some general lessons and some try to understand some of the, so to say, macro dynamics that would help also devise policies that basically help us, for example, IOM, facilitate migration as part of positive adaptation strategies. And I think there's a couple of things there. One is conceptual. I think there is the issue that migration in itself is just a process. And the fact that when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about adaptation at different levels, individuals, households, communities, etc. And I think very often different case studies take different approaches. And this limits how much can we say, basically, to what extent can one answer your very pertinent questions, Roman, about when migration works basically as adaptation on a general level. It's really difficult. And I think from a data perspective, there's early efforts, in my opinion, still early, to truly overcome some of the scale issues related to the migration space and the environment, the climate change space, that have completely different timing and spatial kind of scales to work with. For instance, in my earlier research, I was working in some mountainous communities in Peru, and I still remember the problem of, the environment and climate was changing within very short horizontal distances, so to say, because it was a very steep mountainous area. So within few kilometers by car, so to say, you would find quite different environmental and climatic patterns. And from a migration perspective, it would have been very interesting to understand in depth how they related to migration, but then you only have one meteorological station for the entire area. So for example, the scale was just not working. The timing issue also, because adaptation tends to be a long-term process, migration tends to happen at a very specific point in time. So unless you really design methodologies to look at it, it's really hard. Finally, there is the last point that I want to share. One aspect that I think has a lot of potential for development is getting a better understanding of gender issues. In the most of the studies that I've seen on migration and adaptation look at the households as the point of reference where the migration decision is made. So you often hear about migration of one or more members of the household as a risk management strategy, livelihood diversification, depending on the specific approach taken. But I think that while this is also my experience, the migration tends to be in many contexts a household decision, I think this is not allowing us to really understand the depth and importance of gender dynamics, because when we talk about sensitivity, vulnerability, exposure, all these concepts we look at in the climate change adaptation space, those are all very gendered. And the fact that we look mostly at migration as adaptation with the households as point of reference, I think limits a little bit the level of understanding of power dynamics. And when we say that migration is or is not working for people, so looking at the outcomes of the migration process, basically, for who is it working or is it not working? And I think that is the space where much deeper understanding would also help design policies that truly work for everyone. Thank you.
Very much, Andrea, also for highlighting to us again the issue and the importance of having good data and basically having good understanding also in terms of research and data focus on basically migration and adaptation of who and in what context. And there's definitely a lot that we still need to do in both in terms of research, like academic side, but also from the policy side in improving on this level, in this respect. I would like to thank the panelists for their opening remarks and would like to now turn to some questions that we received during the opening remarks from the audience. One or several questions were asked about models and also relating to data that we can use to better understand where climate migration will occur, which relates to basically some of the points that Dina raised before, that climate and environmentally induced migration is not happening in the future, but already occurring now. And also some of the points raised by Andrea just now in his opening remarks. So I would like to direct this first question to you. What can we learn from the models we have? How can we use the data available to us to better understand basically this phenomenon of climate adaptation, climate migration? Thank you. Maybe Bina, you could go first, and Andrea, if you would like to add something, then maybe.
All right. Thanks. I was wondering who the you was. Thank you. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think maybe I would start with just very briefly talking about the global disaster displacement risk model that we developed a few years ago, and that we're now in the process of updating and improving, and actually collaborating with PEAK to see how we can inject climate change projections. The models itself, of course, they will never reflect reality in any particular way, but they do give an indication of where the hotspots are, and that in itself is already quite important and quite useful. What they do tell us is what, again, and probably unsurprisingly, is that displacement risk in these contexts, and particularly in weather-related events and changes, is a global phenomenon. All countries will be affected to some extent, but highly concentrated in particular regions, such as Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, but also parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly then if you take the slow onset events into consideration, as well as Latin America and Central America. But also what we see when we then attempt to bring in the future, because the risk models that we currently, or that we had until very recently, were operating or using hazard scenarios and models, and also exposure layers and vulnerability, understanding of vulnerability based on existing or today's data. So if we try and inject the so-called shared socioeconomic pathways and climate scenarios, then we can hope, we aim and we hope to look into a much longer term future. And what we've seen with some of the first attempts, that indeed the just demographic growth in itself or change is the dominant factor versus the climate factor, for example, in the context of flood risk and flood displacement risk. So that ties to the conversation we had earlier in terms of the multitude of factors, and that climate is just one of them, and potentially in some instances the least important when it comes to these types of displacements I've been talking about. But for migration in general, that's probably quite different, and other colleagues can talk about that. And maybe just to say that where we still have a huge gap when it comes to modeling is on, for example, drought-related displacement, or so displacement linked to these longer-term so-called slow onset events for various data-related reasons, but also just because the processes are just so different, the dynamics are so different. And I know that there's been a lot of work done in that regard, and that's where, again, what I mentioned earlier, where I think what we need to do as we have the opportunity now, because there's a lot of attention on the issue and potential also for future and for more investment into understanding those dynamics, to not forget that we really need those very localized component data points to come into those models. Otherwise, we'll just be way off of what's actually going to happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Andrea, would you like to add something?
Yes, just to add that I think modeling is promising when we look at it in my opinion, at more forced, so displacement scenarios, especially in the context of sudden onset disasters. And I think that's for, first of all, because in that case, it is a little bit easier to establish a relation between the natural phenomenon and the response that people have, in part because agency is reduced, because it's very hard to model people's agency, especially if one looks into several years ahead. People change their mind, people move many times over years, so it's much more difficult. And also because of a timing issue, because I think what is very difficult is looking into, I don't know, 20 or 30 years in a multi-causal situation One, of course, can do certain things. One can look into climatic patterns, say rainfall variability or other phenomena like drought. One can see how that interacts with harvests, agricultural cycles, etc., etc. So one can look into the future, but it is much more difficult. However, I do think that one thing that models have not done enough, and it's only still relatively recent developments, is really trying to truly integrate different types of data in models that are built on data collected with a truly transdisciplinary approach, where you really bring everybody on the same page and really try and build a model from the very beginning, trying to bring everything together. I think that could help us understand a little bit better than we have. And so I'm hoping that the fact that there are more and more research centers like PEAK and others that are really contributing more to this space can help kind of bridge those gaps between disciplines, keeping in mind that there's people's agency there, and so we always risk falling into a deterministic kind of modeling of what is happening. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I would now like to turn to the topic of frameworks of protection and the role of vulnerabilities. We have also received a comment in the chat about the importance of carrying out vulnerability assessments and the role they play for adaptation. And it was also mentioned that there are significant gaps in the information and data available needed to do these vulnerability assessments. So I would like to direct the question related to this issue to Andrew first. So Andrew, what can we do to identify vulnerable groups, and who are these vulnerable groups when it comes to climate change and the adaptation to climatic impacts? And how can we do better in protecting these vulnerable groups than we do at the moment? Thank you.
Well, I think it's, this also links in relation to the earlier issue in regards to, can we anticipate where the most where the most vulnerable groups are likely to be in the future, so that we just do not wait until climate change takes place and forces them to lose their livelihoods, forced to move internally and then potentially cross borders. So I think we can be doing much more on the anticipatory planning, on the predictive analytics, and I'll just sort of take a step back to the other session, because like we're already working with everyone from the World Bank to Uppsala University, to PIC, to almost all the UN agencies, to see what they're doing in order to anticipate the key drivers, which when combined with climate change is going to increase that level of vulnerability. And it's not, and this is what I've said before, we can't just be working from a humanitarian lens. We've got to be looking very much from humanitarian development, peace building, security, and ensuring that the key stakeholders are engaged. What is it that they are concerned about in the future? So making sure that we are not just talking to the key focal points as we have in the past, like you have participatory assessments, but who are at the back of the tent? Who are the members of the community who are not normally spoken to? And we're talking about women, we're talking about youth, we're talking about LGBTQI groups. How do we be really cognizant of vulnerable groups within vulnerable groups? And so within obviously UNHCR's perspective and what IDMC is obviously looking at, is what we often find is that displaced communities are at the very much at the front edge of climate change. They're the ones who have found refuge, found safety in areas where people have not wanted to be before, and that's often on the edges of deserts or in deserts or on flood-prone areas. So first of all, we have to look at each area, look at its own specific context, and look at what are the specific vulnerabilities of those groups. And then working to what is the identification of vulnerability? Is it women? Is it children? Is it older people? Disabilities, indigenous populations? And how can we look at, I've got a dog, how can we reduce the those vulnerabilities before climate change has a more negative impact, so that we're focusing on preparedness, we're focusing on resilience, and we're focusing on adaptation. Over.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important point that you touched upon. How can we basically increase resilience? How can we basically improve adaptive capacities before even any impacts have occurred? And I would like to direct the next question that is was also asked to us by the audience to Professor Kundu. I would be interested about strategies in the urban context to basically help us to reduce vulnerabilities, or even better to increase resilience and improve adaptive capacities in the urban context, and strategies that would help us to basically, as you mentioned, better prepare urban areas to the changes that you might encounter in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the government should come up in a bigger way, because the informal settlements where most of these migrants come and settle down do not have adequate water supply or sanitation or housing facilities. In addition to this, the basic amenities, I think public distribution system is another area which needs attention, in addition to employment opportunities, because people who are coming in to various classes of cities, be it a small town or be it a big city, I think these people who come do not have adequate skill sets to absorb in the urban economy, because of which they are in the marginal areas, both in terms of space and in terms of employment. So the government really needs to work in these areas in terms of creation of employment for people with low skills. And if those are not available, I think there should be some capacity building even of the skill sets of the immigrants, so that they are absorbed in the economy and there is sustainability in all ways. It's not only in terms of employment, but also living conditions and right to decent life for all. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for highlighting the role skill sets play in basically successfully integrating migrants in destination areas. This was also a point that was raised, a related point raised by Dr. Matur in his opening remarks. I would like to ask Kira if you could maybe add something related to your research on the building of adaptive capacities, and particularly with relation to migration, how we could do better here to basically provide good conditions that can help migration to be successful in the end. How can we basically establish, let's say, a safe space maybe for migration, or people to stay within the original locations? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Roman. And I think it's an important discussion, because we mentioned adaptation a lot, and we mentioned also human agency a lot in this whole discussion. Adaptation means for me that I'm protected from the impacts of from feeling the impacts of climate change, from experiencing those impacts. So this should be the goal of adaptation. If I talk about migration as adaptation, the goal should be that I can live after my migration as well as before, or better, because it's already quite an ask for people to adapt through migration, considering cultural loss, considering uprooting of communities, etc., etc. So while I understand the framing of migration as adaptation, I think the goal of it has to be set, the bar for it has to be set quite high, in fact. So this means that today the people who are moving in order to attempt to adapt to climate change are often more, should rather more be classified as kind of survival migrants, because they are often not doing better afterwards, after the migration. As we heard from Professor Kundu and also from Professor Matur, we see that people are moving and then falling into kind of poverty traps, or are forming a new urban underclass somehow. So I think this is a bit problematic. And then also the fact of human agency was raised. The communities I have interviewed for who were migrating because of climate impacts or who were displaced, they told me that they don't have much agency over their own lives. They're kind of reacting towards the changes that they're experiencing, but they don't have a range of options from which they can choose from, including, for example, in situ adaptation or including diversification of livelihoods. This is not really possible for them. The only option they find is maybe to move somewhere else and then try to survive there somehow. So the overemphasis on human agency is I think also a little bit risky, because this agency, and Bina has said this before indirectly, this agency has been taken away from these people through historic inequalities, etc., and also the prevalent economic system. And there's another point. A lot of these migrants are working inside of this system, for example, for the production of goods that we are consuming here in Germany and elsewhere, and they're not being paid adequately. So, and then again, of this industrialized globalization, they're experiencing the negative effects, which is climate change. So it's a vicious cycle, and it's very hard to break the cycle. So maybe a few points and what can be done to return this agency to people, I think, is to increase their ability to move and to provide trainings for them to be able to make different and better livelihoods after their arrival in certain areas. Because people who are forced to move are often those whose livelihoods are very closely intertwined with the environment, such as farmers, etc. But if you're a farmer and you then are supposed to live in an urban area, what kind of job can you do? It's mostly very hard physical labor that you can do. That is often not even legal labor. So often it's illicit labor. So it's a complete marginalization of these people. So we have to intervene there by targeting trainings and educations towards people so that they can retrain for other jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kira, for this very important intervention and comments. I would like to give the floor to Bina, who wanted to make an intervention related to the issue of the implications for urban areas, if I understood. And after this, I will close the panel. Thank you, Bina.
Thank you very much. I'll keep it really short then, and it links to also what Kira said. I think it's just a classic example what you mentioned earlier, Kira, and then Professor Kundu talked about in terms of the issue of informal settlements and arrivals, because it's what we really are underestimating in a sense is that it's the impact as well as generation of new risk that happens in these types of settings. And it's a classic example of existing endogenous issues and not exogenous again. And it also is a classic example of where there's a lot that can be done, as you say, Kira, and it's where new approaches are called for, I think, in terms of really having an understanding within urban planning processes, really working with urban planners, with city councils on understanding both the potential for arrivals into urban areas and the growth of informal settlements, but also of the high levels of new risks that are being created in terms of onward displacement as well, and also social instability. And you've mentioned already, Professor Kundu, the employment opportunities. Kira, you mentioned training, and then plus, so tenure arrangements. What does that mean for maybe having more flexible tenure arrangements in areas that are not so formalized, but still it provides some protection to those living there? What does it mean for education systems and health systems? And that's where often humanitarian actors, and Andrew, we've been talking about that earlier, come with a classic approach of providing services, whereas now it's really about working together with those service providers in the urban settings that are already overstretched and supporting them to really allow for the new normal in a sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina. And with this, since we're approaching the end of our session, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you again for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with us. I felt this discussion and the exchange between the panelists very inspiring, and I think there were a lot of very, very interesting insights to be gained also for the audience. I think we can all see that there is still from different actors in this field, there is still room where we can potentially do better and possibly improve the situations of communities and people who were forced to move or decided to move because of climatic impacts on their livelihoods and living conditions. With this, I would like to close our panel, thanking again all the speakers, the audience, and also the organizers behind the scenes who have made this event possible. In particular, I would like to mention Swati Pillai from TERI and Saurabh Bharadwaj from TERI, and my colleagues Julia Blocher, Anastasia Poljanska, Kira Finke, and Himani Upadhyay from PIC that have all supported the organization of this event. Thank you very, very much. And I now hand over to my colleagues from Adaptation Futures to officially close the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the hosts, TERI and WASP, I would like to thank all the panelists for the extremely informative discussion and to the participants for their questions that stimulated this rich dialogue. I would like to thank PIC for organizing this webinar. We're grateful for this opportunity to have heard from some of the leading experts in the field of climate change adaptation and migration during the course of this webinar, which also saw around 200 participants join in from across the globe. We'd like to reiterate our thanks for the continued support and patronage of our sponsors, which is critical for the success of Adaptation Futures 2020, given the unprecedented state of affairs. Please do keep checking our website and social media handles for updates and announcements about Adaptation Futures 2020. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.